good to be with you again. Thank you for staying with me on this long path, a long journey. It dates way back into last year when it was suggested that I may want to provide some encouragement and teaching to the church through this medium. I'm grateful for everybody that's encouraged me to do that. And also a good friend, Kevin Beasley, who's helping to put up these videos and make them available to you through YouTube. The channel Church at Opelika, if you want to pass that on and let other people know about what we've been talking about. So we're taking the text 2 Chronicles 7:14 over these months, and we're kind of dissecting it phrase by phrase, and we've been looking at how the contemporary church fits into 2 Chronicles 7:14. The Old Testament church was told that there would be difficult times coming to them, and that they would go through this process of evaluating themselves and how they relate to the difficult times. One of the phrases that we looked at was they must turn from their wicked ways. Then this last phrase, I will hear from heaven, and then the last phrase will be, I will heal the land. I think the land maybe is, of course, the geographical area there that produced the sustenance for their lives. And then also the people that lived around them, lived around Israel, and what effect would Israel's turning from their wicked ways have on those people that were around them. Applying that to the contemporary church, particularly in America, what is it about the wickedness of the American church? What is it the American church needs to do to turn from those things that are not biblically sound practices and traditions that have been a part of the church for generations? And the church needs to be purged of those things. It needs to be cleansed from those practices and those doctrines or those things that they've been habitually doing over the years. And then what is it about if that happens, or that's a process that happens, and it could happen quick? What would be the effect on the land? And so what I've tried to do in the last few meetings we've had together is to describe the lay of the land. What is the land? And we're, as far as the church in America is concerned, greatly benefited by having the productivity of this land, having the benefit of all the material possessions of this land, having the benefit of vast amounts of food and clothing and shelter and the things that have been benefited to us as the American church. And then what about the people around us who live in this land? What's the condition of the people around us, and how possibly that has affected us just like it did the Old Testament people, the congregation, the assembly, the church of the Old Testament days. And by the way, we're to learn from them, we're to study them, we're not to neglect the study of that period of history that's given to us from the biblical perspective, and then we're to see how that applies to us today. That's a statement that Paul makes in Romans 15. And how a revival of the American church would impact these people. Well, what's the condition of the people? We've seen, number one, there's a great migration, we believe, from rural life and farm life into the cities, and I think that's radically affected the view of people and what they think of themselves and what they think of people around them and how they see things. Number two is we've talked about the marriage and how marriage has really changed. And in the last 120 years is kind of the period of time I'm taking. We talked about the impact of this change of the view of marriage in the United States in the culture. This is not everyone, of course, thankfully. But then there's a movement away from biblical marriage, and then the definition of marriage there, and then there's been this change in the sanctity of human life, and not only the value of life, but also then moves into number 4, and that is the sexual permissiveness that's kind of going along with this, that's really impacted marriage, of course, and also experimentation. And we ended last time we did two teachings on that, And it's not a real good picture of some of the trends that are going on in the sexual experimentation and the permissiveness that's in our land regarding human sexuality. So glad to hear from those who write, and I do appreciate that. It's very helpful. This that I received from the teaching last time, the recording last time, I want to use as a springboard to deal with the next issue and describing the land and describing the people of the land in the United States. And here's what I received. I received this email, quote, "I think you should add our education system as a reason our land needs to be healed. Our students go to college and are overwhelmed with liberalism, socialism, and all types of deviant sexual teachings that is immoral, to say the least. Also, I think evolution plays a subconscious role in our country when people think that they came from apes. So why not act like it? Because if evolution is true, then there is no God to whom we have to give an account. Eat, drink, and be merry, for tomorrow we die." End of quote. Now that's a very interesting that's an interesting observation of the land and the lay of the land right now in the United States. And I want you to notice four sections in here in this paragraph that are to be connected. And I'm grateful for the person who wrote this to me. Number one, educational system. Number two, deviant sexual teachings. And we've just been talking about that for the last several, not only teachings, but also practices. Number three, evolution. And then number four, no God. And you notice how all four of these are interlinked and interconnected. So I want to look at now the connection between these four. And I want us to look at how this has happened, well, how I think this has happened. And there's good evidence to indicate that what I'm going to tell you is a lot of evidence to it. So in order to look at the educational system, in order to look at deviant sexual teachings and evolution and the idea that there is no God, the title of this teaching is "The Denial of a Personal Creator God and Its Effect on Education in the United States." And I want to look at two people that have had a profound effect on the whole of culture, particularly our educational system. And the first person that I want us to look at, as you might be obvious, is going to be Charles Darwin. The dates for Charles Darwin are 1809 and to 1882. And it was his work in 1859, and this is predating the 120 years we're talking about, but this is the 19th century, and so the influence of this man and this work is going to bleed into the 20th century and even to today. And his work, published in 1859, On the Origin of Species, in which he took about, one reference I found, about 28 years of research and study, and also involved in this, one source said, extreme, intense mental struggles that Charles Darwin went through. One source that I looked at was Kevin Swanson's book, Apostate, the Men Who Destroyed the Christian West. Apostate is the name, the men who destroyed the Christian West. The Western world was experiencing at the time that Darwin comes in a vacuum that for centuries had been moving away from a bibliocentric view of things. Now, for a long time, Christian doctrine and Christian influence in the culture of Europe, particularly, and maybe coming into the United States, into the 19th century, was beginning to wane. And there was a period of time when that was the case, that Christian doctrine from the church was influencing government, was influencing economics and education and family life, sexuality, community. Those things are very important underpinnings of all of culture. But then Darwin enters into the picture in the 19th century with a materialistic theory of purpose, of design, and the beginnings of all organic life. He would not actually disprove the existence of a personal creator God, but he would postulate a natural phenomena that would be the answer for the development of all organic forms. And this is what would open the way to, in his mind, conclusively reveal that there is no need, or less of a need, for a creator God as the cause of all things. That's from Swanson's book. And then from John West, who is the vice president of Discovery Institute. It's a Seattle-based think tank known for its research and advocacy of intelligent design. John West says that Darwin's theory wasn't just exactly change over time. That's one of it. And not only that, it requires a lot of change for this to occur, also for his theories to operate actually. And this is a theory, by the way, and also of origins. And also, with the class, what you understand to be the survival of the fittest and natural selection and those ideas there. Also, this change over time has to actually be a randomness of some sort of accidental process. So John West says that Darwin has given the greatest gift to people who would like to deny the existence of a personal creator God. Here he continues, West continues, quote, "But it's gone well beyond that. We're seeing Darwinism used to devalue human life because Darwin thought humans are basically animals. At the end of his book on the origin of species, he says it's through death, disease, and starvation that the best things have come about in nature." It is in Darwin's second book, The Descent of Man, and I have to say I was not as familiar with his second book as I was the first one. I've not read either one of them, just quotations from each one, where he rejects any distinct difference between animal kingdom and the human kingdom. It's in the second book, The Descent of Man. In this book, he writes about religion, he writes about morality, about mind, the human mind, and social policy, about how he thinks discovering the human race. He thinks this, that by destroying the human race, we're destroying the human race by inoculating people against smallpox and helping the poor. In other words, he suggests that we should help humans. We shouldn't really help humans that are weak and that are defective. That's from John West's reading of The Descent of Man. In other words, let nature take its course. It gives nature, whatever that definition is, this undefined, powerful control over all things. Even personifies nature as having some undefined power and rule and uncontrollable dynamic. Let the weak die on their own would be Darwin's preference. And then Kevin Swanson continues, and he correctly points out that this philosophy, it's not scientific knowledge, it's just an idea that Darwin espouses, leads to the events that we have known now to be detrimental to the human race in the 20th century. That is the genocide that occurred throughout the world in the 20th century. And so by far the most controversial element of Darwin's theory was found in the application of Nazi Germany, Adolf Hitler's association with some of the readings of Darwin. Darwinian humanism. And let me say this word humanism is old. It's been around a long time, for centuries. but it's the idea that human reasoning will give us the answers to the problems that we have. We do not need any sort of other sources like religion or philosophies or things like that. Religion, particularly the supernatural, we don't need anything like that. Well, all we know, the human reason can give us the power over our difficulties. And so Darwinian humanists, those people that believe that, but they also believe Darwinianism, they're very careful not to connect Darwin's support for eugenics. And of course, you may have heard of eugenics, and that is in the animal world, it's improving the stock of a particular species through a breeding process. And but also the same can be true for Darwinian thinking with those humans, that you can actually breed a better breed a better human person through correct breeding techniques and reproductive techniques. And so here comes the survival of the fittest is front and center. Here's an excerpt from The Descent of Man. Quote, this is what Darwin wrote in that book, The Descent of Man. With savages, the weak in body or mind are soon eliminated, and those that survive commonly exhibit a vigorous state of health. We civilized men, on the other hand, do our utmost to check the process of elimination. The weak members of civilized societies propagate their kind. But no one, continues, he writes, no one who has attained to the breeding of domestic animals will doubt that this must be highly injurious to the race of man. So he continues to say, the aid which we feel impelled to give to the helpless, this aid that we need to give to those people who are inferior, is mainly an incidental result of the instinct of sympathy. There appears to be at least one check in this steady action of the weak becoming more and more, and the bad effects of having weak humans around, is namely that the weaker and inferior members of society do not marry so freely as the sound. Well, he's not finished. In the same book, The Descent of Man, he goes on to say this. He predicts this at some period not very distant as measured by centuries. The civilized races of man will almost certainly exterminate and replace the savage races throughout the world. And I could read the rest of this to you, but that's generally what his thinking is, and generally what his prediction is about the future. Now, some people may defend Darwin as not necessarily prescribing the extermination of classes of human, yet he does not discourage it. So the question is, what about the enormous genocide of the 20th century? Has that a direct connection to Darwinian ideas that were left for humans and were left for people who like to who read and study? Has this led to this connection between the genocide and the eugenics of the 20th century? And Ben Stein thinks it is. In his movie documentary, Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed, and I encourage you to get that DVD, Expelled, No Intelligence Allowed. He does research by interviewing people in the universities and the colleges throughout the United States. He found that a great majority of the universities and colleges has frozen out the idea of a creator God. That's really not a part of their view of things. And so if there's no creator God, that means there's no view of that influence in the origin of all things. Then in his documentary, he does make a connection between Darwinian evolution and the genocide of the Jews in Nazi Germany. So we're going to be talking about the impact of Darwinian ideas in education in the future. So although there's a growing number of scientists abandoning Darwinian evolution, the thinking of the various parts of our culture have been affected by the ideas espoused by Darwin. Here's what John West says. In The Descent of Man, Darwin argues the original form of human mating was not monogamy, but community marriage, lots of different sexual partners. Darwin himself favored monogamy, as in the 19th century Victorian England, but his overall claim was that appropriate mating practice was determined by whatever survival needs you have. If you have a survival need for multiple sexual partners as a human, that's what you practice. He continues to say this. West says he influenced many of the people who made these arguments more widely available in the 20th century in what became known as the sexual revolution. The number one influencer of the sexual revolution is Alfred Kinsey, and he's the one that established the sexual studies at the Indiana University. There's a whole history on Dr. Kinsey and everything that he did. And so most people really don't realize, according to John West, that he got his training in evolutionary biology. There's been this great abandonment of the biblical view of creation and a great abandonment of the biblical view of marriage and family life. But we find in the Bible, we find in this classic, reliable, historically valid piece, wonderful piece of literature that has been preserved for us for centuries and is truth. It has the truth of all things. We find everything about creation, how creation came to be, and about how everything was formed in Genesis 1 and 2. And then we find in Genesis 3, we find the condition of humanity then that springs from the first two humans. And we find the understanding about how all the difficulties and all the problems that have plagued humans come about from those natural evil things and those moral evils that come from the fall of man in that section of human history, in that part of human history, and the consequence of that. And then we find the understanding of family life. We understand the value of value and the worth of humans in creation. We also find the community life after family life is formed and families come together. And then we find this magnificent plan that the Creator God has instituted with buying back or redeeming those things that have been lost through man's mistake that he made in the very beginning by abandoning Creator God and living his own life independent of him. And so we find everything in the Bible about all these answers that have been plaguing humans since the beginning of time. And we do, however, I wanted to make sure you understand that there has been, and you probably already know this, that there's been this abandonment of this view, this biblical view, worldview of how things have come to be and how we are now. And so the American church, if it is to experience repentance, it must return to that view. It must return to that view and hold to it tenaciously of a personal creator God as described in Genesis 1 and 2. And then as the fall of man is the reason for the plight of man that we find even to this day in the early 21st century. And then what is the answer to that plight? And it's the teachings that we find regarding the teachings of the gospel, the clear understanding of this good news that's been presented to man and has been given to him through the work of Jesus of Nazareth, the God-man, the one who is the Savior of the world. And that's the message that's a simple, very powerful message that the church in America must teach, must preach, must live, must practice in order for there to be some sort of awakening in this land and a rejection of these ideologies that have emerged in the last 120, 200 years in our land and throughout other parts of the world And so we have a great opportunity during these days to make a difference. We have a great opportunity as the church that is based upon the authority of the scriptures, the biblical truth of all things. And so we need to live that and preach that, first of all, in our families, then in the communities in which we live, and then as much as we can where our influence goes beyond that into other areas of life with friends and family members. So I encourage you to do this, dear friends. I encourage you to adopt a biblical worldview of all things: creation, fall, redemption, and then there's the restoration of all things. That's the wonderful, wonderful hope that we have, that the personal creator God that instituted all things and brought all things into existence and now is governing all things is the one who is going to restore all things. So the mantra for this is Romans 11. This is the conclusion, Romans chapters 1 through 11, that the writer gives. For from him and through him and to him are all things. To him be glory and honor now and forevermore. So he is the source of all things. He is the guide of all things. And he is the goal of all things. And I hope you will, if you're living that way, I'm excited that's wonderful. If you're not living that way, I strongly encourage you to recommit. If you are a Christian, recommit with great fervency and great dedication to live that way and encourage others to do the same. Now, if you're not a Christian and you haven't considered these teachings, I would encourage you to do that. Please let me know. Let some people who say they're Christians get with them, and you can read the Bible together to understand the truth of all things. That's the first person, Charles Darwin. The second person that I would like for us to consider is John Dewey. The dates for John Dewey, 1859 to 1952. He's not exactly a contemporary of Charles Darwin, but he was highly influenced by Charles Darwin, and he has profoundly affected the educational system of the Western world, particularly the United States, and some would say he is the father of the educational system for our nation. So next time, I'd like for us to, next week, hopefully, this will be posted soon, and then next week, we'll be talking about John Dewey. You may want to do some research on your own and find out something about John Dewey, and even, correct me if I'm wrong about Charles Darwin and about his views of how things came to be and about how things are to be. So thank you for being with me, and please let me hear from you, emails, calls, whatever. They're really helpful, as I just cited to you earlier, this good friend that sent me a response to the teaching that I've been giving. I look forward to being with you again real soon.